and later earned a master's degree in environmental science and a master's of business administration. 40 years ago, Bruce began working on Maryland's Chesapeake Bay water quality and habitat monitoring program as natural resource biologist. Over the years, Bruce worked his way up to becoming Maryland Department of Natural Resources Director of Resource Assessment, with a staff of over 100 employees. RAS, as it's called, is responsible for assessing and protecting the health of all the waters of the state, including Deep Creek Lake. In 2009, Bruce helped initiate a comprehensive Deep Creek Lake water quality and habitat monitoring program, which you just saw the results of. A submerged aquatic monitoring program was added in 2010. Bruce, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, retired from Maryland DNR in May of 2021. And we are fortunate here in Garrett County that he now works for Garrett County to manage and coordinate Deep Creek Lake special projects, including the Arrowhead Cove pilot dredging project. Bruce's talk today is entitled A Historical Perspective of Deep Creek Lake Sediment Studies and Projects. Thank you.
Good. Thank you all. I appreciate this opportunity to be here today. It's great to see everyone. And thanks, Tom, for your presentation. It was awesome. And again, great to see that data. And again, appreciate the questions as well. Those are things that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the day, and how we move forward with monitoring, developing priorities. Unfortunately, we don't have unlimited resources that we can just take care of all of our problems. But through the Watershed Management Plan and Molly's work, that we want to prioritize some of these things that we need to work on. My presentation today is going to focus on the Deep Creek Lake short and long-term sediment monitoring efforts, sediment accumulation and characterization studies, as well as some sediment mitigation and removal projects that have been ongoing. This, back in 2009, as they mentioned, DNR started a comprehensive long-term water quality and habitat monitoring program, and you saw the results of that. In 2010, we added the long-term submerged aquatic vegetation monitoring program. And in 2010, 2011, Maryland Geological Survey conducted a Deep Creek Lake bathymetric and sediment chemistry characterization study. And I want to recognize Rich Ort, who is now the Director of Resource Assessment Service. Rich is here. Rich has had a long-term history with sediment issues at Deep Creek Lake. He was involved in those studies back in 2010, 11. And so we're very glad that, Rich is here today, and he continues to be involved in, addressing Deep Creek Lake sediment issues. And as Director of Resource Assessment Services, making sure that Deep Creek Lake, understanding the processes, understanding what's going on, the implementation of the Watershed Management Plan is a priority for the Department and Resource Assessment Service, as well as the Park Service and the other units with DNR. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about that 2010, 2011 Maryland Geological Survey and how we moved forward from there to develop other studies and assessments on specifically looking at some of the sediment impacts that we've seen over the decades. Okay. There were multiple Deep Creek Lake sediment studies conducted over the years, and that initial work that was done by Maryland Geological Survey, again, this was DNR owned the lake. DNR was doing the studies. So there was a group that said, we need an independent evaluation of the data to see what it basically says. So the Deep Creek Lake sediment study, study on the left-hand side there was instrumental in reaffirming what Maryland Geological Survey had done with their technical assessment, and then identifying coves that were potentially sediment impacted over the decades, over the history of Deep Creek Lake that was developed in 1925. The Cove Evaluation Report was a follow-up to the Deep Creek Lake sediment study, basically looking at some of those results and trying to prioritize sediment impacted coves that were identified in the studies. And then an alternative analysis report was done in 2020, basically looking at other ways to address the sediment accumulation. That sediment study, which was released in December of 2013, again, provided the independent study based on Maryland Geological's work. And this Whitney, Bailey, Cox, and Magnani, they were the ones, the independent outside consultants that were hired to do an unbiased assessment on the lake. The analysis confirmed what the MGS study said, that there were basically 10 sediment impacted coves in Deep Creek Lake since its creation in 2025. Okay. The key findings from that report indicated that the sediment composition is primarily fine-grained, consisting of approximately 39% silt, 43% clay. The sources of those sediments are a consequence of the underlying shale formations within the lake's watershed. The sediment accumulation studies confirmed that sediment is accumulating mainly in those southern coves, southern portion of the coves, and that the sediment accumulation does impact recreation in Deep Creek Lake, and especially in those coves. These are the 10 coves that were identified as being sediment impacted. And you can see, again, Henry's Peninsula Cove, Poland Run, Green Glade Cove, Hazelhurst, Turkey Neck Cove, Chatterton School Cove, Deep Creek Cove, Pinpoint Cove, Pond Run Cove, and Arrowhead Cove. Those are the coves that were identified with the greatest amount of sediment accumulation since the lake was created in 2025. Not only was the lake itself identified as being sediment impacted, but over the years, the tributaries leading into Deep Creek Lake were also sediment impaired. Deep Creek Lake, the watershed was listed on MDE's 2008 Integrated Report of Impaired Waters with Biological Impairment. And this biological impairment listed is based on the combined results of DNR's Maryland Biological Stream Survey, round 1 and round 2 surveys. Maryland's Biological Stream Survey has been in existence for a long time. We assess all the streams and tributaries throughout the state, and that information is one of the key drivers for assessing whether streams are impaired or whether there is an impairment. All of the Deep Creek Lake tributaries have some sort of benthic and or fish index of biotic integrity scores considered to be biologically impaired. And those biological impairments were determined to be primarily caused by sediment. We know that the lake is sediment impacted, but we know that the tributaries that are flowing into the lake are also impacted by sediment. Okay. Since DNR recognized that there has been sediment impairments, we have sediment accumulation in the lake, we continued to do studies on that sediment and tried to determine, again, where does that sediment come from? There's two ways for that sediment to enter the lake. It can be shoreline erosion, and it can also be inputs from the tributaries themselves. So back in 2015 and 16, DNR conducted some additional studies. Again, Maryland Geological Survey looked at the shoreline erosion. Again, these were short-term studies that we were able to look at. That it would be good to come back and look at shoreline erosion. After time, shoreline erosion is a slower process. One of the things that Tom mentioned about the growth and development that you're seeing around Deep Creek Lake, one of the things that you see with more people is more boat use and the different types of boats that are being used. You've heard of the wake boats that are an issue out here that are causing more and more waves, which actually impacts our shoreline. And then also they did a tributary input loading. So they look at nutrients as well as sediment coming into that. And again, it was only a year and a half time period that they were able to collect the data. These projects were funded through DNR's Waterway Improvement Fund. That's one of the sources of funding that they have, and historically, that was something that the department looked at to help fund some of these studies to, again, determine what are the impacts, the long-term impacts of growth and development, what are we seeing in the watershed, and how is that impacting Deep Creek Lake. Okay. All of these studies, the monitoring data that was collected by DNR since the inception of the program, these sediment studies that were done, again, in the main one, the Maryland Geological Survey's studies that informed the December 2013 Deep Creek Lake sediment study. All of those efforts were key pieces of evidence and the driving force for multiple Deep Creek Lake stakeholder, local, state, federal representative meetings, working groups, along with legislative efforts to secure sediment mitigation funding, as well as actions to address the Deep Creek Lake sediment issue. The outcomes of that basically provided the impetus for the Deep Creek Lake Watershed Management Plan. Molly's going to talk a lot more about that management plan later. But everything that we've seen, the data that was collected, the studies that were done, all those were instrumental in pulling together, again, all the stakeholders around Deep Creek Lake, as well as many government officials. And this has been a long, long process. Obviously, when we started the monitoring back in 2009 and 10, all the sediment studies that were done, people around Deep Creek Lake, as well as DNR, the owners of Deep Creek Lake, knew that there was a responsibility to try to slow down those processes over time. Lakes naturally degrade, and that degradation is exacerbated by development and growth. So the development of the Watershed Management Plan, it also drove legislative actions to create funding to help address those issues. And that was key. Tom mentioned the State Lakes Protection and Restoration Fund. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And it also provided the impetus to get a demonstration project for dredging as one potential option for addressing sediment accumulation, especially in those 10 sediment impacted coves that were identified in those reports. The State Lakes Protection and Restoration Fund was funded in 2018, $1 million a year for 3 years was the original legislation. Actually, the State Lakes Protection and Restoration Fund started a year before that. They initiated the legislation, but the governor didn't put any money in it. They were hoping that people would donate to that. And of course, after a year, nobody had really donated any funds to that. So in 2018, Governor Hogan actually put in $1 million a year for 3 years. The purpose of those funds were for removing sediment, treating contaminated sediment, preventing the spread of invasive species, improving the ecological and recreational value, and then taking any other action that the department deemed necessary. We had a question about the underwater grasses. Underwater grasses are obviously provide a great service. They help stabilize the sediment. They produce oxygen. They're great fish habitat. So SAV is actually pretty good. It's the invasive species such as hydrilla that can dominate and take over an area is that you want to potentially get rid of. And DNR did find hydrilla back in 2013 through the SAV monitoring program. And that started the initiation. A task force was put together to look at ways to help treat hydrilla. We don't like to use chemicals in the water to treat that, but we had an expert panel that came together to determine what would be the best way to help manage hydrilla in Deep Creek Lake. And so in 2014, they implemented a hydrilla control program that is still ongoing today. Of course, that's very expensive, but fortunately, the State Lakes Protection and Restoration Fund was able to fund that. But when it first started, in 2000, when we found it in 2013 and 2014, the program was implemented. State didn't really have the funds to do it. It had to come out of the Park Service budget and state budget, as well as we got support from the foundation actually contributed. And I believe the POA also gave some contributions to help address that, because treating hydrilla, fairly expensive project. About, when it originally started, it was quite extensive. We found it in the lake and it was over $200,000 a year. And so anyway, but that's what some of the State Lakes Protection and Restoration Fund covered. Specifically, that $1 million a year that was allocated for the State Lakes Protection and Restoration Fund, almost 50% of that went to Deep Creek Lake. There's 16 state-owned lakes and managed and managed lakes that were addressed that under the State Lakes Protection and Restoration Fund. But a lot of that money went to Deep Creek Lake. And what it covered was there was a shoreline stabilization cost share program, approximately $200,000 a year, that went, again, specifically for that shoreline to help offset the cost for shoreline stabilization. It went for the hydrilla control that I was just talking about. And it also is used to create and improve fish habitat. Okay. Other state-funded programs for sediment reduction and mitigation. The state funded, again, another a demonstration project at Silver Street Shoreline, stabilizing almost 500 feet of shoreline across property, and looked at basically various types of the shoreline protection that can be used at Deep Creek Lake. And this project was also funded under the Waterway Improvement Fund. That project was completed in 2022. Okay. The largest project that the state funded was the Arrowhead Cove Pilot Dredging Project. Again, any dredging project is a very extensive effort. you have to do the design, you have to get all the permits, you have to, do the review, the project. So it was it took really over 4 years to get the design done and to get all the permitting done before the project even started. The purpose was to determine if dredging could be an effective tool for removing accumulated sediment in some of the Deep Creek Lake shallow coves. The total price tag for that was approximately $2.4 million that the state invested in that. And again, the initial design for that project was funded out of the Waterway Improvement Fund, where then later, once the design was done, the state came in and actually funded the whole project, getting the permits and everything afterwards. That funding was provided from the state to Garrett County. Garrett County managed it and hired a contractor, Maryland Environmental Service, to actually hire the contractor that actually did the work. Okay. This is a drone survey of Arrowhead Cove after Brookfield lowered the level in November of 2023 to a level of 2456.5. People that are familiar with Deep Creek Lake know that the water level basically in the summertime is at the highest level. That's where they keep it at a peak of 2461 feet. To do the dredging, they wanted to do the dredging in the wintertime when there weren't as many people here, so you wouldn't disrupt activities. But you can see in these photographs how much sediment is actually accumulated in Arrowhead Cove, over the century of the lake, its existence. And at that 2456.5, that's not even the lowest level. The lake is managed between 2455 and 2461. So that's not even the lowest level that the lake can be managed, in the wintertime. So anyway, it was great to work with, our legislators and everything, and to get this project and to get that project underway. But you can see how much sediment is in that lake. And that cove evaluation report that I talked about, in one of the earlier slides, they used a set of criteria to determine which one of those 10 coves should be dredged. And that was based on economic, environmental, and feasibility characteristics. And Arrowhead Cove was determined to be the cove that was the highest priority and the one that would be most successful for a demonstration project. We removed between 1 and 5 feet of sediment from that cove. And you can see they put a cofferdam in front of the cove to block it off, to dewater it completely. They had heavy equipment in there, excavators to excavate it in the dry, remove the material, and took the accumulated material to the landfill as clean landfill cover. The sediment was assessed before the dredging to make sure that it was clean and that it could be used for clean fill material. The Arrowhead Cove dredging has 2 final reports, a lesson learned report and also a more technical report. Those are all available on the Garrett County website. And all the reports that I've talked about are all available on, DNR's website or Garrett County's website. So if you want additional information, if you want to get into the details about the reports and what the findings were and everything, all this information is readily available. Okay. The findings from the dredging project, that basically we were successful in removing 11,000 cubic yards of accumulated sediment. Mechanical dredging in the dry during the fall and winter demonstrated to be an effective tool for removing a relatively large amount of sediment. The project improved boating and swimming access. You go out there today, during the summer and early fall, the docks were still in there for boating docks. There was plenty of water. That picture that you had of the whole cove completely sedimented in, it was we had good results from that. The SAV and upland restoration after the site was done appears to be good. And again, we're still looking at the impacts of, potentially to fishing. We don't think, again, there's lots of fishing areas, but we certainly want to protect our fish species. Okay. The main issues for mechanical dredging in the dry are basically the weather, the time of year restrictions, water levels, and the high cost. Again, almost $2.5 million to dredge one cove is a lot of money. The state funded that project in its entirety, which is great, but the state doesn't have funding to just go in and dredge all the coves itself. Again, we were very fortunate to get the project done. We got it done in early January. The contractor worked basically almost through the night during the project. We started in November, finished in January, but they worked very well. And we had lights out there at nighttime so they could continue to do the mechanical dredging before the extreme cold and everything froze over, because it's difficult to do that kind of work in the wintertime when it's cold. What should we consider? Are there other opportunities for dredging? Hydraulic dredging might be something that you could look at. Again, as I said, these lesson learned reports can be found on the county's website. Okay. I just want to mention others. The state is not the only one doing projects on Deep Creek Lake. We appreciate the foundation's work. They funded, as Tom mentioned, some of the continuous monitors that they use to assess water quality. The foundation also did 2 tributary monitoring studies in 2022 and 25. They also indicated that the low macroinvertebrate and fish abundance, basically due to siltation, that confirms and corresponds to what the MDE assessments basically said, that the tributaries are impaired for sediment. And then the foundation also supports the 10 by 10 program, which is to reforest the buffer strip along the lake with at least 10% of woody vegetation within 10 years. So these are programs that the foundation and others are also doing work. Okay. All right. Where do we go from here in preventing and addressing Deep Creek Lake sediment accumulation? We need to continue implementing the watershed management plan. Goal number 6 basically says prevent erosion and sedimentation to the greatest extent possible to protect water resources from increased sediment loading and associated water quality problems. Okay. The state has spent considerable resources already on sediment mitigation. And what we've seen is an increase in impervious surface, an increase in growth and development over the years. Okay. We need to continue with these efforts. Just think what the monitoring data would show if we weren't doing these projects, if we didn't have a watershed management plan, if we weren't focusing our efforts. We realize we don't have unlimited resources, so we need to be smart. We need to target, prioritize what our efforts are going to be to reduce sedimentation into the lake. We need to maintain our long-term and targeted monitoring efforts, and we need to continue to think about today to identify additional sources of funding. One of the best sources that we had was the State Lakes Protection and Restoration Fund. That ended last year. There is no long-term funding anymore, like the State Lakes Protection and Restoration Fund, to support many of the lake protection activities. So that's where we need to focus on and stuff. And I think through the watershed management plan and the work that we're doing here today, we're going to have discussions on where do we need to go. So that's it. And any questions? We have time for.
Yeah, we do have some time for questions. Anyone
Okay,
have
if anybody
any?
has any questions, then
Yes, sir.
yes.
I'll get you the microphone.
Could you, I was a little confused. Could you tell us a little bit, like, how are you defining sediment, I guess? Because sedimentation is a natural process that occurs even in oligotrophic lakes. And you talked about the two sources being washing in from tributaries and erosion. But even in lakes that have, they're closed basin, they don't have anything coming in, they have no erosion, there is sedimentation.
Right.
So are you not thinking about just natural production of sediment in the lakes, organic matter, algae falling to the bottom as sediment, or?
Yeah, no, we're thinking about the whole picture. And we realize that, I mean, Tom's presentation, lakes naturally degrade and move to a system of eutrophic. We are trying to slow that process down. Where do we have the ability to slow that process down? And again, what management strategies can we do? And again, some of that shoreline protection, protecting our streams, but we don't have those unlimited resources. So we have to be smart on what sediment we can address in there. Can you dredge out accumulated sediment? Absolutely. But it's very expensive. All of these things cost money. And so what we want to do is we want to be smart about it. We have the watershed management plan, and those are going to help focus what areas that we need to look at. So we're asking input from stakeholders around the lake, what they can do. We want to work with our state agencies to help continue with the assessing what's going on. But anyway, it's a large process, and we just want to slow it down. We know we can't stop sediment from getting into the lake. It's not a swimming pool. So
yes, we have another question.
With all this sedimentation, do we have estimates of how much is from shoreline erosion versus sediments coming in from the tributaries?
Well, that was the thought process when back in 2015 and 16, when MGS did the shoreline erosion studies, and the Restoration Resource Assessment Service did the tributary load input. Those were short-term studies. We would like to potentially, some of us would like, to go back and look at those shoreline erosion studies and see over time how much sediment has come in, how much they're eroding, and potentially even prioritize areas where we're seeing greater shoreline erosion. We don't know specifically, is it 50-50%? Is it 50% coming from tributary loads? Is it 50% from shoreline? Is it 30-70 or whatever? We don't have that information right yet. We have a little bit of information, but we don't have all the information we need to make those assessments yet. That's a good question, though.
Just to follow up on Joel's question.
Yeah.
It looked, and I'm not familiar with every cove or anything like
Sure.
that, but it looked like some of the coves for Arrowhead, for example.
Yep.
It looked like the watershed for Arrowhead Cove is dominated by, let's just call it disturbed land uses,
Yeah, right,
agriculture, urban, quote unquote, rural
Correct.
land. I'm just wondering, is that maybe I'm just putting this out as a hypothesis that the sediment load or the sedimentation in some of these coves is dominated by the watershed sources.
Right.
That the state hasn't really attacked as heavily as
Yeah.
it's attacking the shoreline problem. I'm just putting it out there. I don't know.
No, and that's a great comment. We're actually again, we've looked at, we've done stream walks in that area, tried to identify. There is a quarry upstream. They're meeting all of their sediment requirements, permits from MDE. But we've actually enlisted some help with some grad students and stuff to do a more intensive stream. Arrowhead Run is the drains into Arrowhead Cove there. But to put in some pins and stuff and look at that stream bank erosion specifically to look at that. Yeah, and they're doing that. We're in the process of doing that right now over the next year. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
And follow up on that, I look at Green Glade Cove a lot and try to figure out where that sediment came from. Because if it's the stream running into it's very, it's not very steep. It's not very big, I think, if you compare it to the Arrowhead Cove stream.
Right.
So any thoughts on where that sediment came from? And, at one point there was a discussion that maybe it came from weeds floating down the lake. But it's a pretty big cove.
Yeah, I can't answer that question. Looking at where that sediment is coming from is obviously a key issue. How do we implement strategies to reduce it? We have to know where it's coming from. So those are things that we'd have to look at. And I think that's part of the things that we're trying to figure out is how we can prioritize. Where do we put our resources to keep additional sediment from coming in? Where do we prioritize those areas? And that's why we'd like to, again, we need more information. We need more monitoring information. We need the resources to actually look at that. When you look at those, the tributary monitoring, when we started the program back in 2009, we had, fixed stations only. But Tom and his group are going to start looking at the continuous monitoring data that we have. I think, which takes readings every 15 minutes in these coves and areas. We will be able to identify, again, are we seeing peaks in turbidity, let's say over the weekends when you have more boat activity? So that would indicate that, you're probably getting more shoreline erosion from wave activity during this summertime, especially when those water levels are at the upper level of the rule band at that 2461 feet, that you see more of that erosion. So there are things that we can potentially do when we come back up to the permitting for Brookfield and everything. Can we manage water levels that might be more proactive in reducing shoreline erosion or whatever? And those are things that we would like to discuss when we get up to the permit cycle for relicensing. Again, water level and stuff, wave action in the summertime, they keep it up to the highest level. And that's when you have most of the activity. Maybe you keep it a little bit lower so you're not getting as much shoreline erosion or whatever. And of course, people are always talking about rules and regulations for wake boats and where they can use them and everything, because we realize that's an issue. So, okay, all right.
Okay, any other questions?
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.